This morning, Finland's Prime Minister and President jointly announced that their nation would apply for NATO membership. Finland shares an 830-mile border with Russia. Unsurprisingly, Vladimir Putin has expressed his displeasure with the idea, calling it a mistake. I wanted to talk to the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair about this and much more. Blair is today the executive chairman of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Welcome.
Thank you.
So tell us what you think about this move. Finland and probably Sweden becoming members of NATO. This is a huge change. Finland has been neutral for, decades and decades. Do you think NATO should let them in?
Yes, and I think it's a completely sensible move from their perspective. You've had an act of unprovoked and brutal aggression against Ukraine, and obviously all of these countries are looking for the solidarity that NATO membership gives you. And it's an interesting example of how the very thing that President Putin wanted to prevent, which is NATO becoming stronger and enlarging, is going to be the very outcome of what he's done.
But what do you say to people who worry that this is the kind of westward expansion of NATO that has put a lot of Russians, not just Putin, at ill at ease, that, part of into the kind of combustible stew that produced this problem is NATO expansion and then offering Ukraine and Georgia membership. And this is one more kind of provocation that we should be mindful of Russia's security concerns.
I mean, a little bit of history here, because when I was Prime Minister, for the first part of my time, we were on good terms with Russia. Russia would attend NATO summits. There was every attempt to involve Russia in discussions to make sure that any fears were allayed. Russia was it was the G8 in my time, not the G7. And so this paranoid anxiety about the expansion of NATO being aimed at Russia always has been wrong and misplaced. However, now, with what has been this, as I say, this unprovoked aggression against Ukraine, of course, it's unsurprising that countries like Finland and Sweden now want the protection NATO gives. And I was a strong advocate of countries like Poland, Czech Republic coming in both to the European Union and to NATO after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And if you're the leadership of those countries today, you must be pleased you did that. So I think, at some point, we'll have to work out what the right security structure is and how we deal with Russia on a long-term basis. At some point, we'll have to do that. What's the right architecture? What are the right guardrails to have in place? Because with the old Soviet Union, there were graduated responses. Even though there was hostility, it was a Cold War precisely because there were certain rules. And I think at some point we'll have to go back and explore all of that. But for the moment, if you're Sweden or Finland, you're thinking, I need to be part of NATO, because that is the protection should the type of thing that's happened in Ukraine be visited upon us or we be threatened by it.
Does it strengthen NATO to have these two countries as part of it?
Yes, I think it does. And it also, NATO has rediscovered its sense of purpose. I mean, it's back on its feet again. I think there will be major increases in defense spending in NATO. You see what the Germans have already pledged to do. And to be fair, I think President Biden has done a really impressive job of pulling everyone together in a pretty coordinated way.
People have often said that Europe lacks a kind of strategic orientation, a strategic focus, that it doesn't coordinate on many issues. Do you think this could be the kind of event that triggers something even larger, a kind of coming together of Europe and thinking about its eastern border as its core strategic objective?
Well, I think it's a really good point. And I think that, yes, I think it will mean that Europe thinks much more strategically about its future and tries to get a set of common positions across a whole range of issues. But I also think it will encourage America and Europe together. That transatlantic alliance, I think, also can undergo a revival. And what is important is that we learn from this and that we pivot to what I would call a more strategic view of the world, not just around Russia, but around our attitude to China, to the Middle East, to Africa, where I spend a lot of my time with my institute, and you can see how China's obviously expanded its power and influence there. Russia also moving in recently. we need a whole recalibration of Western policy. And the way that we have assembled this unity on this issue of Ukraine is a good lesson for the rest of the world.
All right, stay with us. When we come back, we're going to talk about when Tony Blair met Vladimir Putin for the first time. I'll ask him what he thinks the world needs to know about Vladimir Putin and much more when we come back. Vladimir Putin's first visit to the West after he was elected president of Russia landed him in London in April 2000. There he was welcomed to 10 Downing Street by the then Prime Minister Tony Blair. Blair met with Putin many, many more times. We are back here in London with Tony Blair.
The aging process is a little bit visible from those old pictures, but anyway.
Not of Putin, by the way, more of you.
Exactly.
What did you tell us? Everyone is wondering about this question. He seemed rational, incremental, calculating, logical. He now seems emotional, angry. What is your sense of the trajectory?
So the first Putin I met was Western-facing, anxious to have a good relationship with the West. He used to insist that we met in St. Petersburg because it's the Western-facing great city of Russia. Then I think he found the challenges of reform and change in Russia too great, and he decided to consolidate power in a more autocratic way and then become a Russian nationalist. And so the second incarnation of Putin, if you like, was cold and calculating and brutal, but still, I would say, entirely rational within his own terms. The anxiety I think everyone has is that he's now completely detached from reality, surrounded by people who won't tell him the truth. And this is why this, incredible miscalculation. Right. Leave aside the wickedness of it. The miscalculation strategically and in every possible way has been enormous. How he could ever have thought, anyone who knows Ukraine, and we both know Ukraine, anyone who knows it, knows that there was never any question of Ukrainians agreeing to be subjugated to Russia in this way. So I think that's the worry. The trajectory has been away from a reforming, Western-oriented leader who could have allowed Russia to become part of the West. People even used to talk in the old days. I'm talking those times when I was there. Then people were even talking about, could Russia become a member of the European Union?
That's right.
Was there a way Russia could be accommodated literally within the structures of NATO? And it's very important people remember this, because this myth that Putin perpetrates, that we were somehow always trying to push him and humiliate Russia. Russia's problem is not the result of our humiliation of Russia. It's as a result of bad government in Russia.
Joe Biden says that his worry is that Putin is cornered and he doesn't have a way out. So what should the West and Ukraine do? Should there be an active search for an off-ramp? Or are you of the view, let's first make sure that Ukraine kind of prevails in this and not worry so much about giving Putin a face-saving way out?
Okay, so I think we've got to be guided by the Ukrainians and their leadership, because their leadership has been incredibly impressive. I don't just mean President Zelensky, but the others as well. But it's been impressive not merely by the courage, but they've showed a real intelligence about how they've approached it. And I think in the first weeks of this conflict, before it became extraordinarily brutal, I think they would have taken a way out and offered that off-ramp. But I think their attitude now, because of the way that Putin is trying to take that whole southern corridor and block Odessa, really, from Ukraine, I think now the Ukrainians will believe they've done well militarily, much better than anyone expected. They're going to get more support from the West. I think they will have to choose the moment, if there is one, at which they look at the possibility of a negotiated settlement. But it's a lot harder to do now, because there is no way any Ukrainian leader is going to agree that Putin should get anything out of this invasion at all. Now, I do think there are larger issues, we were talking about them before, around what is the type of security infrastructure, architecture rather, we need for the future relationship with Russia. But I don't favor pushing the Ukrainians into a premature negotiation, just as I wouldn't hold them back if they consider there is an optimum moment, maybe after the summer months.
And then you get to the game of what does the West ask for in return for the relaxation of sanctions, which is presumably one of the key Russian demands is going to be. And it just strikes me that this is going to go on for a long time. That again, one of Putin's miscalculations is I don't think this somehow magically all disappears. These sanctions have been put in place, the energy depend. The West is going to take its time rolling this back. So would you agree we're looking at a new world and that this is not going to get resolved in years?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. And the thing is, you've got the sanctions, the actual legally enforceable sanctions, but then you've got a couple of other things. You've got, first of all, the fact that there's no one going to do business with Putin. And I think, is it 1,000 companies have withdrawn from Russia? I don't think they're going to go back in whilst Putin remains in power. So that isolation, which is as much voluntary as it is mandated, will remain. And the second thing is that Europe, I mean, it's learnt its lesson now. It will change its energy policy fundamentally to release itself from dependence on Russian oil and gas. Now, it may take some time in the case of gas and so on and so forth, but that's going to happen. It's absolutely inevitable because no one will want to be in a position, again, where there's any question of having a conflict between what you need to do and your dependence on Russian energy.
All right, before I let you go, I have to ask you, you were so instrumental in bringing stability to Ireland, to Northern Ireland. What does it mean that you now have a party in power there that in some ways is part of the old hope of a united Ireland? Is there now a possibility that Ireland and Northern Ireland will be united?
Well, it's back on the agenda, let's say, in a way that it wasn't before. But the key immediate thing, because that's a whole longer term play, the key immediate thing is to get this dispute between the UK and the European Union resolved. It's very, very damaging. It really arises out of the fact that the UK entered into an agreement back in October 2019 that it doesn't really want to keep to. And unsurprisingly, the Europeans are saying you do have to keep to it. I think there is a way through. There is a way through the technical and practical problems of how you organize trade between Britain, the island of Britain, and Northern Ireland. But it's going to require the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, will have to work out what he thinks is a sensible final negotiating position. And then he's going to have to go and sell it and persuade the European leaders. This isn't going to get solved by the systems, not by the Commission system, not by the UK system. The only way you resolve something like this, and my experience of dealing with Europe, is to elevate it to the leaders' level and get it settled there.
One more example of the damage to Britain that Brexit has caused.
Well, it was inevitable we would have this problem because the moment you take the whole of the UK out of the single market and customs union of Europe, where we've been for 4 decades, then the hard external border of the European Union is between the north of Ireland and the south of Ireland. So it was always going to be a problem. And, we just, look, it's happened, Brexit. Obviously, I disagree with it. We've got to make the best of it. But we need to resolve this because otherwise we will put the union of the United Kingdom at risk.
Tony Blair, always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Next on GPS, Putin's war in Ukraine is, of course, not the only crisis facing the world. I will talk about COVID, the economy, much more with a terrific panel when we come back.